Hi there, everyone. I hope everyone's had a nice week and that you're going to have a fantastic weekend. And tonight we're going to do chapter 4 of ELSA, Born Free. It's called The Man-Eating Lions. One day, soon after I returned to Izolo, I noticed that ELSA walked with difficulty and was in pain. It was getting dark, and a long distance of steep, rocky slopes, covered with thorn bush, lay between us and home. Soon ELSA could walk no further. George thought that she might be suffering from constipation and suggested that I should give her an enema on the spot. That meant returning home and then driving to Izolo to get what was needed. While I did this, he remained with ELSA. By the time everything was ready, it was dark. Then I had to struggle up the hills, carrying warm water and an enema and a lamp. It is one thing to administer an enema in a vet's surgery, but it is quite another to do this amongst thorn-covered bush and in the dark to a wildly scratching lion. I congratulated myself when I had inserted a pint of liquid into poor ELSA. But that was all that she would tolerate, and it was, of course, far too little to produce any results. So we had no choice left but to carry her home. Again, I stumbled back to the house, where I collected a camp bed to use as a stretcher, a few torches, and 6 boys to act as porters. The procession then moved up the hill. When we arrived, ELSA rolled at once onto the bed, where, lying on her back, she showed that she was thoroughly enjoying this queer mode of transport. Indeed, it seemed as though she had never travelled in any other way. But as she weighed at least 180 pounds, her pleasure was not shared by the porters as they sweated and panted, struggling downhill, stopping every few minutes to rest. ELSA made no attempt to leave the stretcher, but she had great fun giving an occasional nip on the bottom to the nearest boy, as if to urge him on. When at last we reached home, all of us, except ELSA, quite exhausted, we were obliged to roll her off the bed, for she had no intention of leaving it voluntarily. Later we discovered that hookworm was the cause of her trouble. She must have got infected with it when we were on the coast. It was not long after she had recovered that George had to deal with 2 man-eating lions, which during the past 3 years had killed or mauled about 28 people of the Boran tribe. Many and gruesome were the tales told of their marauding. On a dark evening, one of the lions had forced his way into a boma and seized a youth, who called loudly for help as he was being dragged away. No one had dared move. Only 2 dogs went to his rescue. They ran after him barking, thus causing the lion to drop his prey and chase them instead. But having done this, the lion had returned to his victim, whose cries gradually faded into the distance. As a rule, the Boran are very brave indeed, and are among the few African tribes who will still hunt lion with a spear. They also kill elephant, not for food, but for spear blooding, or to prove their manhood. When elephant are located, there is great excitement and fierce competition among the young men. Each tries to be the first to blood his spear. The one who does claims the victory. No young man is looked upon with favour by the girls until he has worn his spurs by killing some dangerous animal. Until he has won his spurs by killing some dangerous animal. The word boma originally meant a defended place. It is now used to describe an administrative post as well as an enclosed African habitation. 2 other ancient forms of hunting still survive. The whalers, who go out in little boats with primitive harpoons, and the pygmies, who kill mainly for food. When they go out after elephant, one man crawls under the animal's belly and stabs him. Then he goes back to his companions, and only after that do the others join in the hunt. But brave as the Boran are, in this case the man-eaters completely overawed them. This was partly due to the cunning and boldness of the lions, partly to the fact that when hunted, they would always retreat into dense riverine undergrowth, where it was impossible for a man to pose and throw a spear. Superstition had also added its quota to the fear with which they were regarded. It was said that before starting off on a raid, the lions would repair to an open sandy place and there make 2 rows of depressions in the sand with their paws. Then, using the twigs as counters, they would play the ancient game of boa, a game of unknown iniquity, which resembles draft and is played all over Africa. If the omens were good, they would raid a boma and claim a victim. If not, they would wait. Another story had it that the lions were the spirits of the 2 holy men who had been murdered long ago by the Boran and who had now come back in this shape to seek their revenge. So strongly was this view held that the local Boran had petitioned a practicing holy man to come from a great distance to exorcise the spirits. He came with book, bell, and candle, and charged a fee of 60 goats. Yuh! But the lions continued their depredations. To add to the legend of the lions' invulnerability, George and other To add to the legend of the lion's invulnerability, George and other hunters had tried on previous occasions to kill them and had failed owing to lack of time. This confirmed the Boran's opinion that the lions were supernatural beings and that it was useless to hunt them. So now, in spite of the coming rains, we were determined to break the spell. Little did we realize that it would take us 24 days and nights to accomplish our task. We set off, Elsa and myself in the truck, George, a young officer on leave from the King's African Rifles, and a few game scouts in the Land Rover and trailer. We were fortunate to find a good camping site a couple of miles short of Murti Trading Centre. Here we placed our tents under some fine acacia trees near the edge of the riverine bush and about half a mile from the Nyari River. It was set well in the open, an important point when dealing with man-eaters, for they are less likely to raid a camp placed in the open than one surrounded by bush. After pitching camp, we went into Murti to get the latest news of the man-eaters. The place consisted of 3 mud and corrugated iron shops owned by Somalis. They told us that for the last 3 months the lions had not killed a human being, but they had persistently raided livestock. Only a few nights before they had broken into the yard at the back of the principal shop and taken a donkey, and almost every night for the past 4 weeks they had been heard roaring up and down the river. George sent at once for the local headmen and elders of the Boran and ordered them to inform their people living along the river that as soon as the lions killed again, news was to be brought to him. These lions covered an area of 50 miles along the Uzanari River. From the beginning, it seemed as if they were aware of our intentions. They had the terrain in their favor and made good use of the almost impenetrable river undergrowth. They were most energetic walkers and thought nothing of covering 30 miles during a night. But they at least did this in the cool, while we were obliged to follow in the heat of the day, plodding through the thick bush with sharp thorns and palm fronds obscuring our view, or wading knee-deep in swamp and slush through marshy lagoons. To begin with, George had to cover 40 miles before he was able to shoot a zebra. He then towed its carcass into the riverine undergrowth about a mile from our camp and secured it on the ground under an acacia tree, in the lower branches of which, about 12 feet from the ground, we built a machine. For the next 3 nights, George and John, the young officer, kept watch. We heard the lions roaring upriver, but nothing happened. I sat in a camp listening to their magnificent chorus, with Elsa snoring contentedly by my side, inside the truck. Did she not know that her own kin were nearby? The paradox of the situation came clearly to my mind. Here we were hunting dangerous man-eaters by day and by night, yet when we returned exhausted, we looked forward to being with Elsa, who compensated us for the fatigue and strain by her affection. Lion versus lion. Whatever the relationship, I could not help admiring these wild creatures, and George, even though he had every reason to bear them a grudge, since he had once been severely mauled by a lion, regarded them as the most intelligent of all wild animals, and held them in respect. On the fourth night, weary from sitting up, he and John slept in camp. It was that night that the lions came to the remains of the kill. Now another carcass had to be obtained, and once more they sat over it for 3 nights without result. Then once again, exhausted by days spent trying to follow the lion's spoor and sleepless nights, they returned to the camp. Once more the lions took the occasion and came to the kill. By that time we were all half inclined to agree with the Boran that perhaps the lions were the spirits of holy men, or more likely of devils. Now we changed our tactics and did most of our hunting by day, following the spoor into dense bush. Twice we got close to the lions, only to hear them break away ahead without giving us the chance of a shot. Hunting on foot was most exhausting, not only on account of the heat, but because we had constantly to walk in a crouching position through tunnels in the dense vegetation. Nor did the presence of rhino and elephant make our task easier. The rains had started up country, and the river already showed signs of rising. As the lions kept to the other side of it, we had to move camp without delay if we were to get across the ford below Murty. We packed up camp and arrived early in the morning at the ford to find that the water had risen considerably during the night and was still going up. We decided that it was still just fordable by car, though a little stick, which I had stuck into the ground to mark the water level, was soon submerged and then swept away. George unhitched the trailer from the Land Rover and removed the fan belt to prevent water from splashing over the ignition system. Then it crept into the river and crossed successfully. Next, my truck entered with Elsa, as usual, sitting in the back. The water rushed past at alarming speed, carrying debris. The truck got bravely into the middle, then the engine spluttered and died. Nothing would make it start again. We released Elsa at once. She plunged into the water, splashed about, and tried to retrieve the driftwood, as though we had arranged all this for her amusement. Indeed, she had such fun ducking the men who were wading shoulder high, carrying the loads across, that we were finally obliged to tie her up. When at last the truck was empty, we tried to tow it, but it leant alarmingly to one side, and the chains we had brought with us were not long enough. So we had rapidly to improvise extensions with buffalo hide. Eventually, all hands pushing and pulling, and applauded by the ever-present baboons, we managed to get across. Camp had to be pitched on the spot, as it took all the rest of the day to dry out our kit, medicines, ammunition, books, foods, the engine of the truck, car spares, bedding rolls and tents. Elsa spent her time sniffing the still life, including George's tobacco, which made her grimace in disgust. By next morning, the river overflowed its banks, and we had to move to high ground. During the next night, it had rained solidly, and we feared this might mean the end of the lion hunt. Nevertheless, we spent the morning looking for a suitable tree in which to conceal a machon. But the bush here was low, and we had eventually to content ourselves with the Maswaki bush, which was hardly high enough to hold a machon, let alone above the reach of hungry lions. George shot a zebra and put its carcass beneath the bush for the lions. Then soon after dark, he and John took up watch. Perhaps the lions knew how inadequate the Mädchen was. Only 8 feet from the ground, for after about an hour, the men heard 2 of them. One was roaring by the ford 1/2 a mile away, the other across the river. The roars from the direction of the ford gradually grew louder, and there was no doubt that the lion was in fine voice, for the last roar finally shook the Mädchen. Next, George heard the unmistakable sound of the lion tearing at the carcass, but it was a dark night and he could not see anything. They waited for the lion to settle down to his meal. Then John switched on his torch, and the animal became visible. He laid his tail towards them and, with his head buried in the carcass, offered a poor shot, till, disturbed by the light, he turned his head and looked towards the Mädchen. George then aimed at his neck and fired. There was a deep grunt. The lion leapt into the air and made off, uttering loud, gurgling sounds. Evidently he had been hard hit, and George was confident of finding him dead at dawn. As soon as it was light enough, 2 game scouts came to the Mädchen from the camp, and with George and John followed the blood spoor, which led into the dense bush bordering the river. If the lion was still alive, it was a very dangerous position to follow him up. They advanced cautiously, step by step, pausing every few minutes, with ears strained to catch the slightest sound. Suddenly, there was a growl, and George caught a fleeting glimpse of 2 lions making off. Evidently the one from across the river had come to meet his friend. They thought that the next time they neared them, the wounded lion would be certain to charge. By now the blood trail had almost disappeared, and it was difficult to follow the pug marks in the uncertain light. They had stopped and were carefully examining the ground when a game scout tapped George on the shoulder and pointed back. There, 15 yards away, he saw the head of a lion looking at them over a low bush. He shot him between the eyes. A big lion, 9 feet 5 inches from the tip of the nose to the end of his tail. George was sure that it must be the animal he had wounded, as there appeared to be 2 bullet holes in the back of his head, besides the one between the eyes. He assumed that the other lion had escaped across the river, and indeed thought he remembered hearing a splash after he had fired. When I arrived on the battlefield, I gave George full marks for his success. It must have been very frightening to follow a wounded man-eating lion into that thicket. Although we had just spent 3 weeks hunting 3 man-eaters, straining every nerve to catch sight of their golden skins through the undergrowth, this was the first time I had actually seen one of them. Now his strength was broken, his paws, whose great pug marks we knew so well, lay limp. He was in the prime of life, about 8 years old. Of course we were relieved that at last one of the man-eaters was dead. But illogically, we did not enjoy our victory over this splendid animal. After the skinning, I photographed its heart. It was as big as a child's head. Then I understood why I often felt Elsa's heart throbbing like a motor engine against her ribs. That night, George and John sat up over the zebra, hoping that the second man-eater would come. They only got drenched for their pains, but heard a lion roar across the river. Since the water was now too deep to ford and too dangerous on account of crocodile to swim, George made a boat using the steel frame of a camp bed covered with a ground sheet. It was a great success, but unfortunately it could only carry 1 person, so he crossed alone in it and walked to Murty, where the news of the death of one of the man-eaters aroused much amazement and excitement. Now, at last, the Boran were convinced that the lions were less than immortals and were keen to help to find the other one. On the way to Murty, George had crossed the fresh spoor of a lioness. This made him wonder whether it was not her voice that he had heard on the previous night. So he began to question whether the lion he had killed was in fact the one which he had previously wounded. It was not impossible that the expanding bullet from his heavy rifle had smashed the beast's skull, and so perhaps the 2 holes at the back of the head were made by fragments of the same bullet. In that case, there was still a wounded lion on the side of the river on which our camp was pitched. When George crossed back to our side of the river, he found a party of 6 Boran at the ford, only armed with spears and ready to help look for this possibly wounded lion. He suggested that they should return next day with their best hunting dogs. In the morning we met them as arranged, and found them accompanied by the most unlikely-looking hunting dogs, which they, however, assured us were not afraid of lion. Once more we entered the bush. After a short time, George noticed that the dogs were not displaying much eagerness to go forward in spite of encouragement from their masters. Then the pack leader turned with its tail between its legs and headed for home with the rest following him. We all expected to hear a roar followed by a charging lion, but nothing happened. Instead, we heard the excited barking of baboons, a sure sign that they had seen something alarming, either a lion or a leopard. After pausing, with ears and eyes strained, we moved on. Then as George stopped to pass under a bush, something light-coloured caught his eye. In a real fortress of thorn bush crouched a lion, apparently ready to charge. George was about to fire when the loud buzzing of flies told him that the animal was dead. We found that the bullet fired from the Machin had torn its throat, probably damaging the jugular vein. It was a really magnificent lion, 9 feet from tip to tip, not as large as the other, but a much handsomer animal, and I felt like saluting the great beast, though he had caused so much terror. Both lions were in perfect condition, about middle-aged as lions go. Certainly they had no disabilities to justify their man-eating. Most lions take to man-eating because they have some infirmity. Either they have been wounded by an arrowhead or damaged in a trap, or their teeth are in bad condition, or they have porcupine quills in their paws, or they are very old and in this state turn to less agile forms of food than is natural to them. But there are exceptions, cases where one can only guess at the whim of nature which has induced them to hunt human flesh. Has this taste been aroused by the carelessness of the tribesmen, who often sleep at night outside the thorn fence, which protects their livestock? If a hungry lion who was considering the painful act of breaking through the fence to kill an animal inside were to find a dinner asleep outside, he would be tempted indeed. Could he be blamed for taking the easier course? Such a happening might well become a habit and give birth to another man-eater. Naturally, his cubs would learn his way of hunting, and so the trait might be carried on by teaching rather than by hereditary instinct. Now our task was accomplished, and the Boran would no more be troubled by the spirits of the holy men. We reflected, however, that there was a good reason to suppose that the 2 lions had sired several lusty cubs, and we could only hope that they had not been trained to their father's tastes. Unfortunately, we had evidence recently that this was the case. And that's the end of chapter 4. And tomorrow we'll be doing chapter 5, which is a safari to Lake Rudolph. So, good night, my friends. Hope you have a peaceful sleep. May your gods go with you. See you soon. Ciao, ciao.